Since the beginning of human history, violators of law have been executed for their crimes. Governments, or whoever was in charge of law, would and still do execute people for everything imaginable. In some places, it's a simple miscompliance with often very stupid rules and regulations from corrupt governments that can get someone killed. It's good that in the US, the only offense that can get someone the death penalty is aggravated murder. I'm here today to argue that the death penalty in the United States should be abolished completely. I will cover why it is ineffective at whatever perceived goals it is supposed to be accomplishing, why it is a dangerous policy for a country to adopt, and the more humane solution that would separate us from a primitive past. Okay, so one of the main points that death penalty advocates go over is they say that it is a deterrent of crime. They think if the criminal sees that someone is being executed for this offense, then they won't want to commit the offense because that's human nature. This has a lot of flaws in it. First of all, it's assuming that they're thinking logically, which is wrong for two reasons by itself. If they're going to commit that kind of crime, they're probably not going to be thinking about the consequences. And such crimes usually happen in the heat of the moment rather than premeditated. Also, I was studying criminal justice for the majority of my college time here. Those are the classes I've taken mostly, and learning about motivation and why people do things and how deterrence actually works. In order for there to be a deterrence, there needs to be a swiftness and a certainty, which there's neither of these things because the death penalty is convoluted. You don't know who's going to get it, and it can take years to get. In an article that was the transcript of hearings on future capital punishment in the state of New York, Jeffrey Fagan, PhD, stated, he was talking about studies that linked studies that said that deterrence was actually, it was working for, that the death penalty helped deterrence. He said, these studies are fraught with technical and conceptual errors, inappropriate methods of statistical analysis, failures to consider all the relevant factors that drive murder rates, missing data on key variables and key states, the tyranny of a few outliers and years, and the absence of any direct test of evidence. Another thing that they say is they think it's cheaper, but actually, the thought is that it's cheaper to keep someone in prison for life than, or it's cheaper to kill them than to keep them in prison for life, but because of all the actual appeals and things it takes. For example, Richard Diter stated in a testimony to the Judiciary Committee of Colorado State, everything that is needed for an ordinary trial is needed for a death penalty case, only more. More pre-trial time, more experts, more attorneys, etc., along with more kids. Now I'm going to move into why this could be a dangerous thing for a nation to adopt. It could really undermine the trust that we have in the justice system for several reasons. This is Todd Willingham. There was a documentary made on this man because he was accused of burning down his house, arson, and killing his two young children inside. There was an inexperienced fire committee that actually said that he committed the arson, and this man was actually put to death. Later on, after his death, there were more experienced people, that arson investigators, that actually went there and said, there's no evidence for this, we probably executed an innocent man. The reason this is so important is if there's no real reason to have the death penalty, if it doesn't really have any benefits, then there's only a risk in having citizens be distrusting of the government if innocent or possibly innocent people are executed. In an article written on deathpenalty.org, the author states that since the reinstatement of the death penalty, 142 men and women have been released from the death penalty nationally, some of them only minutes away from execution, which obviously shows it's not a very effective system. How much do you really trust the government to choose who lives and who dies? Apparently, the death penalty can really be determined on arbitrary factors, since it's only a couple of aggravated murders out of 1,000 that would actually go to the death penalty. How do you trust for them to take the right ones? For example, here's a chart on who is actually executed by race for the death penalty, where obviously there are far fewer blacks in the United States than there are whites. They actually outnumber the whites in the executions, according to deathpenalty.org. Now I'm going to move into why this is barbaric and inhumane. And actually, I'm going to reference fiction first of all. In the Green Mile, there was a scene in which Percy, the guard who was not to be trusted at the prison, decided to play an experiment with Chief, who was going to be executed. What he decided to do is, for when they had the electric chair, he put the sponge on the head without adding any water, which actually burned the man alive and he was tortured to death. Now, why is this relevant to today? We don't use the electric chair anymore. Well, I needed a picture to show what an execution could be like, because they don't really show pictures of somebody being killed by a needle. But let me actually read to you from the Washington Post. Tuesday night, Oklahoma tortured a man to death. The article goes on to explain how they thought the man was sedated, but he wasn't, so he consciously died from a heart attack. This is still barbaric. In an article written by the ACLU, they stated, "In civilized society, we reject the principle of literally doing to criminals what they do to their victims. The penalty for rape cannot be rape, or for arson burning down the arsonist's house. So we should not, therefore, punish the murderer with death. Capital punishment is a barbaric remnant of uncivilized society." By removing ourselves from having capital punishment, we will also be removing ourselves away from societies that are primitive and that execute people for bad reasons. We want to be as far away from them as possible and have it as humane as possible. So the call to action is actually really simple. If there's any legislation regarding the abolition of the death penalty, which there very reasonably could be in the near future for either nationally or at a state level, support its abolition because it's outdated.